For those of you who don't know, my name is Christian Hudak. I am the Executive Director of the Dunhuang Foundation, which is based here in very hot Houston, Texas. Thank you to all of you who are making time in your evening to join us. It's fantastic to have such a large crowd from all over the place. We had almost 130 people sign up for tonight's lecture that will be given by Ms. Anne Feng, who I'll introduce in just a moment. This is the fourth of a 5-part lecture series. The fifth part of the lecture series will take place 2 weeks from now, and that will focus on the former imperial capital of Chang'an, which is now present-day Xi'an in central China. So tonight's lecture will be hosted by Anne Feng, who's a professor at Boston University. Anne is a wonderful young scholar who's worked with the Dunhuang Foundation numerous times. We feel so really just delighted to have her as a resource and somebody that we get to collaborate with. She is a graduate of the art history program at the University of Chicago. She was one of Wang's students. Really fantastic young scholar, and she is going to be speaking on a topic that is near and dear to our hearts here at the Dunhuang Foundation, and she's speaking on Dunhuang. And more precisely, she's speaking on Dunhuang's, a little bit about the history of the site, but about the history of Buddhist art there. And that is actually one of her topics for her dissertation, and her research is both on Buddhist studies and art history. She is a scholar of Buddhism and Buddhist art history, and again, we're just really quite thrilled to be able to work with her. She's a fantastic individual, a good friend, and I'm happy to introduce her to you this evening. For those of you who haven't been on these, they're broken into 2 parts. The first part is about 30 to 35 minutes in length. Then there will be a short question and answer period of about 10 minutes or so. We'll have a 5-minute intermission and then do the same and wrap up promptly tonight at 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 Central. All right, without any further ado, I introduce you to our lecturer for this evening, Anne Feng.
Hi, hi everyone. Thank you, Chris, for the really kind introduction. And I want to thank Chris and Julia for helping me set up the webinar series and join this webinar series. And I want to thank the Donghuan Foundation again for supporting my work and kind of helping my own research. I know this year has been quite of a special year. A lot of us have been planning to go to Dunhuang this summer. But we are still here in America. I was planning to go for research, and I hope today I can recreate a little bit of that experience of going to China, going to Dunhuang and seeing the caves. And I know some of you that are joining us tonight have been to Dunhuang and have very close connection with the arts and the culture of the place. So what I'm gonna do tonight is I will have kind of 3 sections of my talk. I will talk about why Dunhuang is a really important place to understand China and the medieval world, how it kind of was rediscovered in the 20th century. Part 2, I'm going to talk about kind of 3 important caves at Dunhuang and give you kind of an overview of the vocabulary for understanding the site in terms of architecture, themes, and then artistic practices. And then for the last part, I'm going to give you a little sneak peek of my current research, my current work. So again, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A. So feel free to enter if you have any questions about what we covered today or things about Dunhuang, just please send in your questions into the Q&A box, I think. And then after 30 minutes, we can come back and I can answer some of the questions that you have. I will share screen now. All right. So where is Dunhuang? That's kind of the basic question. So Dunhuang is in West China. It is in this place called the Hexi Corridor, and this is a very unique geographical location, both in terms of geography and culture. As you can see, it's really situated in a place that is the crossroads between different cultural spheres. So Dunhuang as a site to the east is heavily influenced by Chinese culture, and it was kind of controlled by different Chinese dynasties and regimes. It also fell under Tibetan rule for about 60 years in the 9th century, so it has a lot of Tibetan influence as well. And to the north, there's nomadic steppe culture. And to the west, it is also deeply connected to these Central Asian oasis towns around the Taklamakan Desert, and has kind of diplomatic relationships on with that side. So it's really a crossroad between different cultures, and also a very important stop on the Silk Road. This is to give you a sense of the site. So this is me going on a hiking trip. You can see that the caves, these Buddhist caves, are situated in a desert land, and it is alongside a river, and you can kind of see the river valley, and the caves are located here. And as you can see, it's very much an oasis location, and in these kind of desert terrains where there's water, you'll see kind of greenery and plants grown. So it's very much situated in a desert environment. This is to give you kind of a view of locally the Dunhuang region. So when we talk about Dunhuang, we talk about the entire area. And the site, the main site is called the Mogal Caves. So you can see that the Mogal Caves is actually located about a 20-minute drive away from the Donghuang township. That is kind of agrarian, right now a kind of prosperous small city, mainly kind of features tourism as its main kind of income. And the Mogal Caves is located in this kind of river valley between the Sanwei Mountains, which is rocky, to the east, and the Mingsha Mountains, or the mountains of Sing Sands, to the west, which is a kind of a sand dune, sandy mountain. And a lot of people kind of miss this, but when you travel from the Dunhuang town center to the cave site, you actually have to go through a historical cave site. And this kind of gives you a sense of what's the nature of this place. It is kind of, you're in the realm of the living in the town, you transverse the land of the dead, and you enter into Donghuang, the Mogal Caves, which is kind of this kind of Buddhist sacred transcendental realm. The cave site, there's over 735 Buddhist caves on the site. It's along this cliff surface, which is about 1.7 kilometers wide. There's about 2 districts. On the south side, there are 492 caves. These caves are kind of worship spaces. Images you see of Dunhuang mostly come from the south part, where they're painted, ornately painted with sculpture and murals and different types of decoration. On the North District, this isn't really kind of open to tourists and visitors. This is kind of the traditional living quarters for monks and also artisans. And there has been a continuous construction of caves from the 5th century all the way to the 14th century. So almost 1,000 years of continuous maintenance and construction. So at Dunhuang, you really get to see almost kind of its own history of artistic development, which is very unique and special when we study art history, that you have this amazingly preserved site and it documents its own history from the 5th century all the way to the 14th century. And I have, oh no. And these are kind of, I have historical photographs of what the site used to look like before modern conservation projects. So on the north, you can see These are individual kind of caves that are living quarters. And sometimes they're burial sites. There's still kind of human remains and bones scattered around this area. And a lot of kind of artistic implements and fragments of sutras and daily implements that they found in the northern site. And in the southern site, this is what the cliff surface used to look like. A lot of the chambers have been eroded, so you can see the inner cave interior. Right now, when you go there, because of recent conservation work, they're all sealed off, so you wouldn't see things exposed like this. I have a friend of mine actually took a drone video illegally around the site, but I want to show you kind of the expansive kind of geographical context of the Mogal Cave site. So I'm just going to point out to you. So here on the lower corner is the northern district, and this is a view south down the river valley. So and this is the where the bus stops are. So if you go and visit Dunhuang, they will first take you to a visitor center. You'll watch an IMAX movie explaining Dunhuang, and then you'll be kind of shipped here on buses. And this is where you get off the bus. You cross the river, and you kind of queue up to enter the cave site. So this is the drone footage. So the drone is flying south. And you can see on the east side, on the west side is the Mingsha Mountains, a very sandy kind of mountainscape. And on the east side is the Samay Mountains, which is rocky. So they really looked at the kind of feng shui of the region and selected this site. So all the caves that, when you go into a cave, all the caves, you're basically facing west. So you always know that your left-hand side is the north wall, and your left-hand side, your right-hand side is the north wall, and your left-hand side is the south wall. And because all the cave doors face east, so in the morning you actually get some sunlight into the caves. So my talk is going to focus or try to answer 3 questions. The first question is, why is Donghuang so important? How was it rediscovered in the 20th century? And then we're going to look at the Donghuan Caves and kind of look at them in terms of architecture and theme and kind of Buddhist religious practice. And the third part is kind of how I understand how to study kind of Donghuan Caves in my own work. So the first question, how was Dunhuang rediscovered in the 20th century? So this was kind of a coincidence. It's a famous story that there was a local Taoist abbot, Abbot Wang, who was taking care of, or self-proclaimed that he was taking care of the site, the Mogal site. And it's a strange kind of setup. He's a Taoist priest, but he's looking after this kind of Buddhist caves. And while he was kind of walking around and maintaining the site in the year, the first year, the beginning of the 20th century, on June 22nd, he entered into this large cave and noticed that the wall was a bit funny. And then he kind of realized that there was actually a hidden chamber inside. And this is kind of an early picture of Cave 17, where the manuscripts came from. So he discovered 50,000 medieval manuscripts, which was probably one of the most important archaeological findings for not only sinology, but the history of kind of the medieval Silk Road since the 20th century. So this again, you can still visit the site. This is usually where you begin your tour. They will take you to Cave 16 and then show you Cave 17, which is this very small kind of enclave, a kind of little hole in the wall. It's numbered Cave 17. This is kind of a numbering sequence issued by the Donghuan Academy. Sometimes this cave is called the library cave because it has a lot of manuscripts. People think it's a library, and I'll talk a little bit about why it's kind of understood as a library and certain issues with that question. So he found these 50,000 manuscripts. He knows that they're old. So Abbot Wang was he did alert the local authorities, but of course, China was going through a lot back then. So he didn't get that much feedback, or people didn't really pay attention to his discovery. So the manuscripts kind of started to move out of the original archaeological setting. And a really important moment happened in 1907, 1908. There were, first came Earl Stein, who was a Hungarian British archaeologist that was traversing Central Asia and surveying a lot of archaeological sites. This was kind of part of what we call the Great Game of great powers coming into Central Asia to understand more military and geographical knowledge of the site. And these kind of explorers were traversing the Taklamakan Desert. And Stein heard about the discovery and came to Dunhuang in March 1907, and he was able to persuade Abbot Wang to sell him a large portion of documents. And of course, Stein's feat was also quite famous, and soon a lot of people started to come. The other important explorer that came was Paul Perrio. He is a French sinologist. He was trained in different languages. He was fluent in Chinese. So he was actually able to read a lot of the documents and kind of sifter through it. Stein didn't read Chinese, so he took a lot of paintings. So the result of this is that the Donghuan manuscripts, they're kind of scattered around the world. The two kind of most important collections is in the British Museum and British Library, that's taken by Stein. And also Paul Perrio took another cartload of, I guess, a few thousand manuscripts into Paris. So the study of Donghuan manuscripts became an international endeavor, and I think that is still kind of crucial for the kind of formation of the field today, that there are scholars of Dunhuang all across the world because the manuscripts have left its original location and has traveled to Europe, across China, and also some in America as well. And again, I said this was probably the most important, one of the most important archaeological findings for sinology, the study of China, and also the medieval world. And this is really much related to the nature of these documents. We think they are, they were accidentally put in there. They weren't supposed to be kind of preserved in that way and discovered. They weren't edited. These are raw materials that came out by accident. And they reveal kind of a different side of the ancient world that we've never really had access to, because before this discovery, we were reading transmitted texts that were heavily edited by people that came afterwards. So the manuscripts came in 17 different languages: Khotanese, Sanskrit, Sogdy and Tangut, early Tibetan, Old Uyghur, a lot of dead languages, although the majority are still kind of Chinese copies of Buddhist sutras. We have documents of different religions, Nestorian Christian texts, Manichaean texts are very, very rare in the world. And also a lot of kind of documents related to daily life, like contracts, games, artist sketches. So it really gives you a view of the lived world in the ancient times. And I'll give you kind of a few highlights of the Donghuan manuscripts. So they come, the manuscripts come. So the manuscripts are written in different languages. This is to give you some examples. There's Chinese Christian manuscripts. This is a Book of Omens in Old Turkic. These are Jewish prayers. We also have documents that reflect travel and trade in the medieval world. This is a collection of invitation letters of a monk called Dao Zhao, who was traveling from Song China, from this place in Wutaishan in East China, and he was on a pilgrimage to India, and he had to transverse Tibetan territory, and at each township he needed a letter of invitation, and he collected these letters of invitation, and somehow this collection of letters was left in the library cave. So it actually shows you almost a kind of medieval pilgrim monk's passport traveling the Silk Road. We also have documentations of kind of the history of communication, the history of print. Famously, the Dunhuang library cave yielded what we call the earliest printed book, which is the Diamond Sutra. So these are scrolls and they're fully printed. We also have documents that reflect early science and technology. These are Donghuang star charts, charts of the sky, and these are cloud divination, so different forms of clouds and how you can read them. We also have documents that reflect really on-the-ground religious practice religion. This is an altar diagram that has kind of the ritual master's own annotations of where to put certain objects, what colors should this kind of mandalic space be like. So this is a kind of a traveling ritual master having a diagram that kind of guides his ritual, and it's kind of folded up. So we really kind of see a very palpable side of kind of a lived reality in the medieval world. We also have traces of workshop practice that's related to painting history. This is this is a monk image, and these little dots are actually punctuated. So this is actually a stencil for artisans to use. So you'll put this against the wall and you'll pounce, use a pounce, and then the kind of ink powder will go through the little holes and leave a trace on the wall, and then you'll trace that. So these are kind of vestiges of medieval workshop practice. You also get to see the artist's hand in action. So these are almost kind of scrapbooks of a novice painter. You can see this person is really trying to perfect how to kind of outline a eye in 3 strokes, and he or she is really going at it. This person is training to produce a kind of almost a kind of 3/4 kind of profile image of a middle-aged man, and he's still trying to figure out the perfect shape of the nose. So we have such a rich resource of materials, diverse languages, different purposes, different forms, different languages, and people has different theories of why there was a kind of a hidden cache of manuscripts. Some people imagine it as a library, but given kind of the nature of the documents, a lot of them are reused manuscripts. There's kind of scraps. There's different theories of why, first of all, why are they collected and why is it hidden? So there's 2 main theories. One is there's foreign invasion, and these manuscripts are kind of local treasures, and the local community wanted to hide their treasures and sealed it off in case of Intine before foreign invasion. And but then people kind of question that because the manuscripts, as you can see, they're really kind of scrapbooks of artists. They're kind of fragments. They're not, some of them are great quality, but a lot of them are used documents. So there's another theory attached to these manuscripts. One is sacred waste. So a lot of these manuscripts are actually Buddhist sutras, and Buddhist sutras carry the word of the Buddha, you can't really just get rid of it. And to kind of, we think this cache is probably kind of a disposal of sacred waste, kind of a respect, a way to kind of bury these manuscripts. But these are still open to debate. So fast forward about 30 years later, so when Abbot Wang discovered the manuscripts, the library cave became really famous and important internationally, but because there was war and turmoil in kind of the mainland portion of China, no one really sent experts to take care of the cave site itself. The Donghuan Academy was not established until 1944. And this was during the Sino-Japanese War. I'm personally quite interested in this early history of the Donghuan Academy. I'm looking at important actors that were involved in the studying of Donghuan Caves as art. Before that, it was really much a forgotten site, and people didn't really regard this as high art or something related to the history of Chinese art. And it's really much in the 40s that a lot of important players came west during the Sino-Japanese War, looked at Dunhuang and had new ideas about what is Chinese art and how does kind of these Buddhist caves fit into the history of Chinese art. Many of you probably know about Zhang Daqian's travels to Dunhuang and how he painted replicas of the caves. I'm more interested in kind of these two figures, Wang Ziyun and Chang Shuhong. And Chang Shuhong actually became the first director of the Donghuan Academy. They were both art students that studied in Paris. Wang Ziyun was a well-acclaimed sculptor, and Chang Shuhong was trained in oil painting. And Wang Ziyun, during wartime, China, a lot of artists were retreated to the Sichuan and Chongqing area, and the nationalist government that were settled there wanted to find resources, mostly for oil, in the Western regions, and they sent various expeditions into West China. And Wang Ziyun led a team for archaeology and ethnography. And they really looked at different sites in the Hexi corridor, which includes Donghuang, and tried to kind of understand both ethnic history and artistic history of the site. And this was a group of photographers and kind of art students that went on this expedition. And they went to Donghuang and started kind of seeing these Buddhist caves as art and something you should copy as an artist. So Wang Ziyun started with this idea. Chang Shuhong was really someone that took this idea and went a step forward, saying that the art of Dunhuang is related to New China. This is the art forms that we should look at to create a future of Chinese art. And after 1949, Chang Shuhong was very much involved in kind of creating a new modern view of art for the newly kind of established People's Republic of China. And Chang Shuhong also institutionalized replica painting of these caves. So he would train artists to come and kind of copy the Buddhist cave murals as kind of an art student's education. And this tradition, which is related to the founding of the Donghuan Academy in the 1940s, still continues today. And there's still an active art department doing replica paintings at Dunhuang, even though we're currently in a kind of digital age. We're more interested in kind of digitally capturing these caves and exhibiting them. But these kind of replica caves are still actively used for exhibitions. For example, there were 3 replica caves kind of established at the Getty Center in 2016. And Dunhuang is deeply involved in kind of the creation of a new kind of new China cultural identity. This is Chang Shuhong's daughter, Changshan, who is interested in taking all these patterns from Donghuan Caves and kind of designing new objects and new architectural spaces, new clothing and textile for the new kind of socialist China. And just to give you a fun fact, if you've been to China for various occasions, you would know Maotai Baijiu. And you'll notice that the trademark are these two kind of fairy-like figures. And these images actually directly come from Dunhuang. These are called flying apsaras. They're kind of celestial beings that come and adorn the site when the Buddha shows up. So that's kind of how Dunhuang was crucial to understanding not just the history of China, but also modern China, and why its rediscovery in the 20th century was so important. So what kind of caves are these, and what was the kind of fuss about these kind of Buddhist art caves? First thing to kind of talk about is the Donghuan Caves. Sometimes they're called frescoes. However, their technology is slightly different. Frescoes are commonly used in Western art and Italian painting. They're called frescoes because you have to paint when they're fresh, when they're still, the plaster is still wet, and the pigments kind of bind with the plaster and then becomes calcified and turns into a painting surface. Chinese mural traditions are a different technique. They don't use wet plaster, and pigments are layered upon the ground layer. And these are mostly mineral pigments, and they sit on top of the ground. And there's no kind of chemical reaction or calcification of the plaster. So I'll talk about 3 caves today, and I think we're at 7:35, so maybe I should do this in part 2. Chris?
You can, if you want to do maybe one right now, Anne, and then we can just finish up after the break.
Sure.
Okay.
So I'm going to walk you through 3 caves today. They kind of transverse 3 centuries at Dunhuang, and you kind of see the development of cave types at Dunhuang from the 5th century to the 7th century, and you gradually see kind of earlier caves have more Western Indic features, and then closer to the 7th century, you see more kind of Chinese-related themes come in. So the first cave is cave 254. One of the kind of most important 5th century early caves. This cave is called a central pillar cave because there's a central pillar in the middle. This cave type, scholars think it comes from India, from Chaitya halls. These are worship spaces in India. This is a Chaitya hall in Ajanta. And at the end of the cave, you would have something called a stupa, which usually holds the relics of the Buddha, and you can circumambulate around the stupa inside the cave. And scholars think that cave 254 is kind of echoing this kind of earlier Indic prototype in terms of architectural language, that it is a space for circumambulation. So when you go into the cave, you pay respect to the Buddha, and you start to walk around the central pillar. This is a view of 245, the interior space. It's slightly darkened because in the 1920s, white Russians, which are refugees that were fleeing kind of the Soviets, entered into kind of Central Asia, and they camped out at Dunhuang in the 20s. And you can see traces of their open fire, and how kind of their cooking has basically kind of darkened the cave. So usually Donghuan Caves are quite interesting because you don't really see traces of soot, of candlelight, or active burning. This cave is dark because of the White Russians in the 1920s. And I will kind of walk you through this really important section of the mural. This is a illustration of the narrative of a previous life of the Buddha. So the Buddha lived multiple lives and finally was born as Siddhartha and then became the Buddha. His previous lives are kind of collected as narratives. They're called Jataka narratives. So each story talks about a previous life of the Buddha. This is the Mahasattva Jataka, or the Hungry Tigress Jataka. And the story kind of tells how this Prince Sattva, donated his body to a hungry tiger. So Sattva and his two brothers went hunting in the woods one day, and Prince Sattva noticed that there was a tiger that was about to kind of starve herself to death. He was too weak, it had a lot of tiger cubs, and he became compassionate, and he hatched the plan. So he asked his two brothers to go away for a while, and while they're away, he lay down so that the tiger could eat his flesh, but he noticed that the tiger was too weak, so he climbed up to a cliff and then poked his throat so that blood will come out, and then he jumped off the cliff so that the tiger can smell the blood and be aroused to able to eat his flesh so the tiger can live and save her cubs. And this is a wonderful demonstration of Donghuan artists' creativity and artistic practice. This is Sattva first puncturing his own throat and then diving to his death. And you have this wonderful composition of two mirroring figures. And just to give you a close-up, the two figures are actually looking at each other. So people would say this is a view between life and death, that he's looking upon himself and thinking about the inevitable kind of cycle of life and death. And he plunges to the depths of the valley. There's blood that spills out, and the tiger family kind of eats up his body. And his relatives come back and they realize what has happened. And you can see that they're shocked and in agony with these kind of gestures of pain and disbelief. And one of his relatives is collecting Prince Sattva's remains in a bundle. And with his remains, they honored him for his compassion and erected a 3-story pagoda. And you can see that they're using his remains. There's still little bits of bones that these kind of celestial beings are collecting and placing into the pagoda. And in terms of composition, this is a very complicated small section of the mural. So it starts with Prince Sattva standing and noticing the tigress. He plunges to his death. His body is consumed. His body is transformed into bones and then turned into a stupa, or a 3-story pagoda. And there's this wonderful kind of echoing between kind of the body of Sattva before and then after, as kind of a symbol of Buddhist compassion, as a architectural kind of marking of his relics. And placed inside the cave, some scholars have suggested that this theme of donating your body is central to meditation practices. In Buddhist meditations, there's often a sequence in which you meditate on the scattering of your body, and the offering of your body, and situated while you're kind of entering into this kind of space for circumambulation, it reminds you of that act during meditation, to donate or forgo your bodily remains, which is central to kind of ideas of Buddhist emptiness. So that is the first cave, and I think I'll talk about the next 2 caves in part 2. And I would be happy to answer any questions.
And thank you so much. We have some questions that are coming in. So I'll give you a break to get some air or some water for a second. And I'll start with our first question. Would Professor Feng be so kind as to elaborate on the pigments used in paintings, particularly the blues? How were they both used and obtained? And lastly, if there was there a known meaning to certain colors as there are found in Tanka paintings, for example?
That's a great question. Blues are always kind of a special color in different cultures. I know, I think the most highest form of blue is usually lapis lazuli. At Dunhuang, I would say earlier caves from the 5th to 6th century, blues on statues are usually all lapis lazuli. We know that lapis lazuli come from areas like Afghanistan, so there was trade that was facilitating this kind of mineral pigments to come into Donghuang. Later on, that kind of turned more into azurite, which is more used in Chinese painting for blues.
Okay.
Green. So the pigments are a combination of kind of mineral pigments, and some are kind of combined vegetable pigments. In terms of symbolic meaning, I think it was less codified at that time, as in Tanka painting afterwards. Mm-hmm. But definitely there is an emphasis on blues and greens. That goes all the way back to kind of Chinese paintings as well.
Okay. There's a thread of continuity there between paintings found at Dunhuang and later paintings that are, you'd see like, I don't know, scholar official or literati painting even.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. Our second question is, how recently were you at Dunhuang last? And any speculation on when tourists may be able to return?
I think I was there 2 years ago in November for a conference. Okay. I wanted to go back in the summer. I have heard that tourism has opened up right now. I know domestically people can travel there right now, but I don't know if they are receiving international visitors yet. I hope they are soon.
Yeah, we had heard too that they had a number of domestic visitors, but I haven't heard anything about international myself, not at this point. But that is another excellent question. Our third question is, how important were merit-making activities in these caves? And do we know if and how they were used for ritual purposes?
Yeah, that is actually a central question for everyone studying Donghuan Caves. Mm-hmm. So first of all, yes, the caves are quite dark, and I said there isn't that much trace of candle soot or lamp soot. We don't really know what was used for lighting up the space. Therefore, we don't really know what kind of ritual activity happened in there. Right. We do think that there is a theory that Dunhuang art, all these caves are created for merit, and that's the main purpose, to create these spaces as Buddhist devotion. We do see in inscriptions that we find in the caves or certain steles, families would say that they are creating this cave to worship the Buddha. So the act of creating these caves is merit generating. Mm-hmm. In terms of ritual, it's a very tricky question because there's different types of caves, different families, different rituals. So we don't really know specifically what's going on in the caves. But there are traces of ritual activity. There are altars, there are little hooks that probably banners were suspended.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not definitive, it's strongly suggestive, but we're not quite sure exactly when, where, why, or how.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds like there's a lot of potential for further investigation there.
It is very case by case, I think.
Yeah.
Every cave, there's like 400 caves there.
Okay, so a final question is, how does the artistic production we see in Dunhuang, a border city, relate to that found in the imperial court in Chang'an, specifically during the Tang Dynasty?
That is a great question, and I'm actually going to talk quite extensively about that in part 2. So that's
Okay.
a wonderful question, and we will talk about how Donghuang is both has its local identity and culture very strongly, but is also very cosmopolitan, and it's very clever of negotiating all these different great powers that are around it. So you can see that in the art.
Okay, so they were able to kind of strengthen their position because they were in such a strategic location that it was kind of essential to learn how to do that at an early juncture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Oh, well, Anne, thank you so much. Right now we are at 6:47 Central Time, 7:47 Eastern. So if we can take a 5-minute intermission and come back at 6:52 Central, 7:52 Eastern, I'll look forward to seeing you then. Okay, everyone, welcome back. Thank you to everybody who has stayed on the line for the second half of this presentation, and to all those who have had to go a little early. I saw there was a question regarding recording. Yes, we are recording the entire presentation, and we'll make that available at a later time. So thank you for that excellent question. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Anne Feng back to the stage.
Hello, am I back on? Is the video on? It's all good?
Yes, Anne, that's good. We can see your slides very clearly.
We covered why is Donghuang really important, and we're kind of in the thick of it. We're kind of looking at the caves, individual caves and little details. So we looked at a famous early cave, Cave 254 from the 5th century, which is called the Central Pillar Cave. Next, we're going to look at something quite different. It's from the 6th century, Cave 285, and for a lot of people, this is their favorite cave, and I think you'll know why in a moment. This is something called a meditation cave, which is questionable, related to someone's question about ritual. So Cave 285 was created during the Western Way. So the Western Way is kind of a nomadic tribe that settled in central China. They adopted Buddhism as their state religion, and it kind of broke into different factions. So the Western Way took care of like the western part of the empire, and Dunhuang was kind of folded into the Western Way. And we think 285 is such a special, interesting cave, and it was created during basically the Western Way prince was sent to govern this site. Donghuan, again, is never really a big cosmopolitan center. It's always slightly peripheral, yet still strategically very important. So it was a big thing that a Western Way, kind of a prince, came over to take care of the region. So this was in the kind of mid-6th century. And this cave is quite interesting. It has an open kind of, so there's no central pillar. It has an open hall. And it has all these small little enclaves attached to the sides of the cave. So there's 8 of them. And they were bricked over around the Tangut or Mongol period, maybe the 12th, 13th century, we're not sure. So these were little enclaves. They're about the size in which you can just sit in. They're not very large. So scholars looked at this floor plan and immediately thinks that this again relates to a Indian prototype, which is called a vihara. Previously, we looked at the Chaitya cave. That's a worship space. There's a stupa that marks the presence of the Buddha's relic, and you will go and circumambulate and worship the Buddha. The vihara is more of a monk's kind of residential gathering space. So you would have a central open hall, And then you will have these smaller cells, monk cells, and they will live here. And in terms of kind of the typology of architecture, it does very much look like a Vihara cave, a Vihara space with Indic traditions. And scholars call this a meditation cave. Some of them think that monks actually meditated here, and but this again is quite questionable. These spaces are very small. You can basically just sit inside. And there were actually monk remains afterwards. It was kind of used as a burial space. But what is undeniable is that meditation as a theme is central to this cave. There are many, many images of meditating monks in this cave. So here is two statues that kind of flank the main Buddha image. We know this is a monk in meditation because they usually have a little hood on. And they are sitting, because it's cold in these places, and they're sitting in a meditation posture, a mudra. This is a dhyana is meditation, so we will call this a dhyana mudra. You'll hold your hands palms up together on top of your lap. So when you see a monk in this kind of position, they are meditating. So it's definitely related to the theme of meditation and related to monks. But if monks really were meditating here, we're not sure. This cave is everyone's favorite cave for many people, is because it has really wonderful kind of artistic practices that come from different traditions in terms of style and in terms of subject matter. This cave is quite special because it has kind of this light white painting background, which is rare for these caves. It's very bright when you go in. This is the ceiling of the cave. We would say this is a celestial canopy. So this is the center space is kind of imitating these tassels and textiles, kind of hanging from the ceiling. And this part is all kind of wind gods and mythological creatures, thunder, and different kind of escape a celestial kind of portrait. And what kind of sky is this? Is this an Indic kind of imagination of heaven, or this is a kind of Chinese imagination of heaven, or what does this kind of represent? We have winged horses that are flying. We have phoenix or peacocks. Again, these are the flying apsaras, these celestial beings that come. They usually show up when the Buddha is present, and they will toss flowers, they'll play music. We have these kind of 9-headed or 11-headed creatures. These are from Chinese mythology. And then we have these wind gods. These are Central Asian wind gods. And they kind of make their way all the way into Japan later on. Some of you might recognize these kind of wind gods. And this is a detail of wind god, and the painter is really good at showing movement and dynamism. You can almost feel that these creatures are twirling in the air, and they're kind of catching the wind. There's kind of zero gravity, they're almost weightless, and their body gestures are kind of twirling and acrobatic, and there's these kind of flying tassels that you can see faintly. And I love these kind of blue dots. You can kind of almost feel like it's the artist kind of pressing on the mural surface, creating kind of a solid round dot, and then quickly moving it in one direction and leaving this kind of dry trail. And if this kind of presence of these dots that are kind of broken up really gives you a sense of motion, things coming into being. And I've learned a lot from the artists that are there trying to kind of paint replicas, and they say that this, it's almost as if the artisans in this cave, they don't really work with stencils. kind of pattern books. It's really kind of the artist's hand, and they're freely creating these shapes in the mural surface. They're not really working with grids and kind of outlines. And in terms of subject matter, it's quite diverse. You have these Armani jewels that are kind of these precious magical jewels that are heavily mentioned in Buddhist sutras. They're kind of wondrous jewels. They represent the power of the Buddha, but you also have these Chinese deities from Chinese mythology that go way back in classical Chinese kind of thought. So these are representations of Fuxi and Nuwa. They're kind of creator deities. Nuwa is responsible for creating humankind through clay. And kind of Fuxi is her kind of male counterpart. And you usually see them holding a ruler and compass. And they are kind of half human, half kind of beastly, sometimes serpentine. And here again, you see Fuxi Nuwa holding a compass and a ruler, and they're half human and then half kind of serpentine or creature-like hybrid creatures. So it's a Buddhist cave, but you're seeing kind of Chinese mythological deities coming in. So that's the canopy. And if you focus on the four walls, you also see kind of a disjunction in artistic practice. So a lot of scholars think that there might be different workshops or artists that come from different areas and trained in different practices. They might have collaborated on this project. So I'm going to show you the north wall. So when you go into cave, your right-hand side is usually the north, because all the caves are, the main wall is usually the west wall. So on the north wall, it is a white background, and these are images of donors. These are female donors in long kind of sleeves. There's ribbons. These are kind of more central China, kind of East China kind of attire. This is an image of a Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva is also kind of a heavenly celestial being, just a rank lower than the Buddha. They're enlightened, but they stay in the world because of compassion, and they want to save all sentient beings. And they're usually dressed more ornately than the Buddha. Their prototype for this kind of ornate dress goes back to when the Buddha is still a prince, Prince Siddhartha, before leaving the world of riches and achieving enlightenment. So they're usually ornately dressed. So this Bodhisattva, if you look in terms of style, this is West China and Dunhuang, but you can see these very stylized drapery. They're very angular and pointy. And this is related to kind of Wei period. Buddha statues are usually very elongated, very kind of, they're known for these kind of very geometric drapery. They're very stylized. You don't really see that much fleshiness of the body. It's really interested in the form of the robes and these kind of elongated faces and very sweet, delicate features. So this is the north wall right here with a white background. And the main wall is really interesting. And you can see that in terms of color, it's much more rich and robust, and it has a kind of a red kind of ground color. And I want us to look at these two deities next to the Buddha, these two sections. And surprisingly, these are actually Hindu gods. And they're kind of Hindu gods in their kind of multiple head, 6 arm, 3 head form. So kind of important Hindu gods, Shiva and Vishnu. Here we have the peacock god Kumara, and then Ganesha if you're kind of familiar with South Asian Indian art, these are well-known kind of deities. And the fascinating thing is that if you look at India in the 6th century, you wouldn't find Vishnu and Shiva in this form. They wouldn't look like this. And some scholars have hypothesized that these are images of these Hindu gods going through places like Khotan in Central Asia, and translating kind of into their local Central Asian styles, and then coming into Dunhuang. So there's 2 steps. It's not directly from India. Central Asia is a very important kind of way station for artistic practices and religion. And if you compare paintings on the north wall and the main west wall, you can see that they're definitely done in almost by different hands and different kind of interests in aesthetic style. So in this Vishnu figure, you can see it has very broad shoulders, a very tiny waist. This painter is interested in kind of shading and delineating flesh, very kind of expressive eyebrows, large kind of eyes and kind of bulging nose and features. Whereas on the west wall, we have a very different mentality of producing the body in shape. The body is very hidden. It's kind of buried in these stylized draperies. And the features are kind of small, delicate, and sweet. So this cave actually encapsulates different modes of artistic practices on the Silk Road, and Dunhuang kind of looking at its neighbors, looking at its kind of ruling patron, the kind of Northern Wei prince that are bringing in artistic styles from the east, from mainland China, and combining them in this really interesting cave, Cave 285. And the last one I'm going to talk about, and I'll lead into kind of my own work, is Cave 220, also a lot of people's favorite cave, especially my favorite cave. This cave was kind of produced in the 7th century in the early Tang, and it belonged to one family. So these previous caves, we think, are more public communal projects, spearheaded probably by the clergy. Cave 220 is very much a domestic family project. And we know this is what we call a family cave, kind of probably one of the first family caves that we know of, is that they actually wrote it in the cave itself in ink, if you can tell. It says the Jai family's cave right here. And this family actually took care of the same cave for about 300 years. This rendition was produced in the mid-7th century, from about 20 years, from 642 to 660. And then 300 years later, descendants of the Jai clan came back and reworked the cave and added kind of new images that were more popular 300 years later. And you can kind of tell this reworking that the ceiling is a later layer of painting. And this lower section is more of the original 642 rendition. This cave is interesting because there was a layer that covered the 7th century layer, and this outer layer was kind of taken off in the 20th century. So the pigments are still quite fresh. We get to see the original colors of the 7th century that hasn't been so heavily oxidized or changed by time. And this cave is a typical new style of cave at Donghuang. In modern kind of typology, it's called a truncated pyramid ceiling cave, mostly because its ceiling resembles kind of this pyramid shape and cut off kind of top. So it's truncated pyramid. And it has an open space And usually you would go in, there's an altar space that has kind of the Buddha, his disciples, those Bodhisattva figures or guardian deities. And on the two sides, you had two full walls. And on these walls are new types of paintings, which we call transformation tableau. So we have open kind of painting space. There's 3 tableaux in this cave, and I'll kind of introduce you to them one by one. So what is a transformation tableau? So there are a lot of Buddhist sutras. Sutras are kind of Buddhist scriptures that talk about Buddhist philosophy, and there's a lot of kind of stories and narratives. There's different sutras for different topics. And transformation tableau are kind of visualizations of textual material, or it's the same kind of religious concept. There's a sutra, and then there's kind of the imaging of those philosophical concepts. So you have transformation, bian, which is kind of, in Chinese, it means magical, it means kind of transformation. And then you have xiang, which means image or tableau. So combined, it's called bianxiang. And in English translation, it's called transformation tableau. In Cave 220, you have on the south wall is a rendition of the Western Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha. So in later kind of what we call Mahayana Buddhist thought, there are multiple Buddha lands. So Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, is the Buddha of our world, but there are millions of other worlds out there, and each world has their own Buddha. And there is a place in the West that's governed by Amitabha Buddha. And when you die, you can pray to Amitabha Buddha, and he will bring you to his Western paradise. And this place is so wondrous, it will guarantee that you can become enlightened and move beyond kind of the cycle of samsara, the kind of the cycle of life and death. So this is a wondrous kind of Buddhist paradise where you go when you pass away. So this is on the south wall, and then on the north wall is very peculiar. This is a painting that refers to the Sutra of the Medicine Buddha of the East. So we have a Pure Land in the West, we have a Pure Land in the East, and the Medicine Buddha is kind of related to healing. So on this image, this is probably an image of a healing ritual. I'll give you a better image. So in the healing ritual, you're supposed to make 7 images of the Medicine Buddha and light candles and lamps in front of it. And also you should suspend these kind of banners to honor the Medicine Buddha. So this is a big kind of healing ritual, actually. And it's and this is kind of the Eastern paradise of the Medicine Buddha. And it's a really beautiful land. The paradise is known by kind of as the ground of jewels, of carnelian, of lapis lazuli. And you can see the artist really trying to give you a sense of the material quality of these gems. This is a kind of the lighting ceremony. This is a light wheel. This is a light tower, and you can see the individual little flames on top. There's music and dance, heavenly music and dance. And this dance is what we call a Sogdy and Whirling dance. Sogdians are these kind of Central Asian merchants that have brought kind of Western tastes, music and dance, and mostly trade artifacts or merchants into China. And they're associated with this kind of whirling dance, which you dance to the beat of a drum, and you stay in this kind of small mat area. So these are kind of representations of that very popular whirling dance. And the painting details is quite breathtaking in this cave, that you see instances of shading, really new interest in delineating kind of the fleshiness of these celestial figures, very complex halos, interest in kind of transparent effects of halos and drapery. These are all kind of foreign painting techniques you don't have in China at that time. We do think this is a moment when Dunhuang became closely associated with the Tang Chinese Empire, which is called the Tang Dynasty at this time. So, and the Tang Dynasty is interested in kind of recruiting painters from across the kind of Eurasian continent. And we think that this new painting technique is related to the influx of new painters from different regions. So since this is a cave that belongs to the Jai family, we do think that their main concern is kind of healing and also rebirth. And I'll talk about kind of the background of the 640s when this cave was created. Dunhuang was a kind of a frontier border kind of land for the Tang Empire. The Jai family were loyalists to this new Tang regime, and they participated in the Tang campaigns into Central Asia. And some scholars think that this cave relates to kind of the Jai family, kind of fallen soldiers and people wounded in these kind of military campaigns. And the Jai family is painting not just to pledge allegiance or to kind of introduce these kind of new painting styles from Tang Chang'an, kind of the Chinese capital, the cosmopolitan capital, but also as kind of a political statement. So this is kind of the doorway, the east wall. And this is a portrayal of another transformation tableau, which is a magical debate between this very clever layman called Vimalakirti, who's a layman. So he's dressed like a Chinese gentleman. And he has this kind of debate with Manjushri, who's a Bodhisattva known for wisdom. And they debate about kind of emptiness, non-duality, and important kind of Buddhist philosophical points at this time. And the most interesting thing for this transformation tableau is that there's a lot of audience that participate and witness this debate. And amongst the audience is this figure here. That is a kind of a classic representation of a Chinese emperor. Long sleeves, this very ornate headdress with these beads that dangle in front and in the back. These kind of Chinese-looking ministers. And this type of image is deeply associated with the capital of Tang China at that time, Chang'an, current day Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors are. And you can see by the kind of mid-7th century, the Tang China was trying to expand into Central Asia and sending kind of military troops to control and eventually setting up garrisons to control the Silk Road trade in this region. And Dunhuang was a very important frontier. And this is, students of Chinese art will be very familiar with this type of imagery. This is a painting scroll currently at the Boston MFA, and this is a painting that depicts emperors throughout the dynasties that was commissioned by the Tang Emperor in the 7th century to kind of understand or adjudicate good behavior of previous emperors. And it's the same emperor that's launching these campaigns into Central Asia. And this is done by this emperor's court painter. And it was created in the mid-7th century. And you can see almost how quickly these images travel and end up at Dunhuang. So the Jai family is very clever at kind of pledging allegiance to this new regime. And again, this is interesting because Dunhuang is always a bit out of sync from, it is part of China now, but it was always a bit out of sync from kind of the central plains from China proper. And I think that makes this place a very interesting kind of case. So that's the three caves from the 5th century, 6th century to the 7th century. We looked at Central Pillar Cave, that's related to circumambulation. We looked at Cave 285 that have mixed painting styles. It has a strange kind of structure that is related to Vihara caves in India, which are monks' living quarters. Meditation is an important theme for Cave 285. And then we kind of looked at Cave 220, that is a truncated pyramid ceiling cave created in the early Tang period in the mid-7th century when the Tang Empire was moving into the region. And we can see how the local Jai family, a prosperous family of the Dunhuang region, is using their kind of merit-making activity and their kind of devotional practices as a statement to their allegiance to this kind of new Tang regime in China. So we talked about Buddhist topics, Buddhist practices, meditation and ritual, painting styles, artistic practices, where artisans come from. And we also looked at the patrons. What's their motive? Why are they kind of bringing in new subject matters and new painting styles? So we looked first at, so today we kind of begin with why is Donghuan important? How was it rediscovered in the 20th century? How is it related to kind of modern China and kind of contemporary China? We looked at three kind of highlight caves, three famous caves. A lot of people are really drawn to these three caves. That gives you a good sense of the evolution of how of arts and artistic practices in the early half of Dunhuang. Later on, it became occupied by Tibetan forces, and then later on became semi-independent, and then was kind of drawn into kind of Tangut Empire, and then kind of so on and so forth. So it's kind of a changing kind of context. And last bit is how do we study Donghuan Caves? And I'm just going to give you a preview of something I've been working on. This is, of course, open work. I hope my article will come out soon, but this is definitely something I want to develop more. So I'm also constantly thinking about, as an art historian, how should we approach Dunhuang and how do we study it? So I'm going to guide you through kind of this image and kind of my thinking around it. Students of Chinese art will be very familiar with this image. If you talk about landscape painting, you will go to this image. It has kind of this beautiful use of continuous space. You can almost see the distant horizon. It has a very clear sense of a space and recession of pictorial space. And also you can see how there's almost these kind of contouring kind of brushstrokes that kind of chisel out the borders of these rocky boulders. So almost like axe cut strokes that we talk about later on in Chinese painting. So scholars of landscape art really like this mural segment at Dunhuang from the 8th century. And the narrative is usually how does landscape kind of develop into what we know as Chinese landscape painting. And this is just to give you an example of ink landscapes in the Song period. But I feel like there's something lacking because everyone's looking at the waters, the boulders, the horizon, but no one's really focusing on this figure who's engaging with landscape. And actually this is a woman, a lay woman, not just a nun, but a lay woman. And the question I wanted to answer was, who is she and what is she doing? Why has no one really talked about her when studying this kind of landscape setting? And what does it mean when a woman engages with landscape? And that becomes quite problematic if you kind of dig deeper into this question. So I started looking for people in landscape around this time period and earlier on. I don't see any women. I usually see monks meditating, as we saw in K285. He's in deep meditation. Landscape is this realm when you can go and meditate in kind of solitary kind of confinement. It's quiet. It's an ideal place for transcendence. You also have these kind of literati, Chinese literati, and landscape. This is a section from an instrument that's held in the social repository in Japan. And we do think these objects come from Tang China and entered into the Japanese imperial collection. And this image shows kind of two guys kind of looking at mountains, and what are they doing? They are holding a brush and paper, and there's an inkstone. They're probably writing poetry. So guys kind of going out and aesthetically kind of taking in the landscape. When you see women in landscape, they're usually part of the landscape. This is a famous painting of Gu Kaizhi, and it tells this love story between a prince and a river nymph. So here we see the man looking at the woman, and the woman is a nymph. She is entangled in landscape. She is part of landscape. She is to be domesticated, conquered, or courted in kind of a love story. So we don't really see images of this, of women being kind of aside from landscape and then engaging with it independently. There's no kind of erotic or love-related narrative. She's not a monk, she's not kind of a monk in the wilderness. She's not a gentleman writing poetry. What is she doing? And I'm trying to kind of come to, this is something I'm working on. I feel like this is an untold history of how landscape in this period, a very crucial moment in landscape development, is centered on this kind of female gaze of Vaidehi as a Buddhist laywoman practitioner. Later on, like she is a kind of a disciple of the Buddha. The Buddha teaches her to see afar, to kind of meditate on the Pure Land. And there are this kind of, as artists kind of use this to experiment with and construct very profound changes in pictorial space during this time period, centered around her activity. And I kind of look at, that's a very small detail. It actually, this is actually a very small detail in a mural, and I try to look at context. What is the context, painting context, spatial context, religious context of this image? This is actually a detail from the Western Pure Land transformation tableau we just studied. This is kind of the paradise in the West, governed by Amitabha Buddha. If you die, you can be reborn there. It's a wondrous place full of jewels and gems. In the 8th century, it is structured at this kind of celestial palace, and there's this beautiful vista and bird's eye view of the Pure Land. And the Pure Land is always related to kind of these kind of perspectival views. So these two strips are actually kind of parts of what we call the Meditation Sutra, which is the textual basis for this image. So there is actually a story of this woman. Her name is Lady Vaidehi, of kind of her fate and how she became kind of a Buddhist practitioner. And this side is actually how she meditates on the Pure Land. And eventually she gets reborn in the Pure Land. So there's on one side is kind of the story that led to this event, her religious practice, and then finally in the middle, the goal of her destination, to be reborn in the Pure Land. And so who is Lady Vaidehi? Who is this woman? She is actually a royal consort of a king, King Bimbisara, that was in India when the Buddha was still alive. The king's son, Prince Ajatasattu, staged a palace coup to seize power. So the prince imprisoned his father, and wanted to starve him to death. And this is when Vaidehi makes kind of her entry. She tries to save her husband by kind of covering herself with honey and then visiting her husband and feeding him honey and keeping him alive. And then her son finds out that his father isn't passing away or starving to death, and it's because his mother. So he confronts his mother and wants to kill her, which is kind of the most tragic thing in kind of Chinese Confucian thought, right? Your son trying to kill the mother. So this is usually famously portrayed as a dramatic moment when the prince is furious and is kind of pulling out a sword and chasing his mother, and Lady Vaidehi is kind of fleeing with her kind of beautiful sleeves kind of tossing in the air. The prince's ministers stop him, saying, "This is too much. You cannot kill your mother. You should imprison her and keep her alive." So she's imprisoned. And when she's imprisoned, she asks the Buddha to come help her. And the Buddha kind of shows up when she's imprisoned. So there's a very clear sense of a narrative of the lady becoming more and more imprisoned, deeper into the palace, and how she reaches this idea of transcendence, how she wants to move beyond her kind of confinement. And as you can see here, architecture, 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 the Buddha shows up with landscape elements. And that's the central theme, that landscape and Buddhism, the presence of the Buddha and landscape are kind of intertwined in this moment. And the Buddha shows up, and the Buddha teaches her how to meditate on 16 different objects to construct a Pure Land in her mind, and then she can be reborn on it. So this image is actually the first meditation, and she's supposed to meditate on the sun, in a distant. The sutra, the ritual mentions nothing about landscape. So it's very strange that you could just paint her with her looking at the sun. You don't need the landscape at all. So that's very odd. And again, why landscape and why her? So I looked at the earliest images of Vaidehi, and this is why Dunhuang is so important for us, because a lot of the earliest images are only found in Dunhuang. So I looked at the earliest images we can find of this figure, and I ended up with these images from this cave 209 from the early 7th century, and I see landscape again. So there's definitely a connection. She is always connected with landscape. And I try to kind of study these images, but the scholarship on these murals are very scattered. Not a lot of people talk about these images. And here I just want to show you how in the 7th century, there's great developments in landscape. These are still, in the 6th century, is still very stylized, heavy kind of pigments of blue, opaque blue and green. Here you see wash, you see kind of details that gesture towards kind of landscape painting as we know it today. So I went to the cave and realized, okay, this is why there's not a lot of study of it, because the cave environment has been interrupted. These figures were erected in the early 20th century. They're Taoist gods. They weren't part of the cave program, and it's very hard to find a clear view of what I want to see in the back. They're all kind of fragmented in documentation. This is kind of the Taoist, 20th century Taoist figure with the orange face in this cave. So I looked at old photographs from the early 20th century before the Taoist figures are installed, and asked a friend to help me recreate the cave digitally so I can have a better view of what this cave used to look like. And these are kind of views of when you go into the cave, reconstructed. I got rid of the Taoist figures, and I realized the landscape with Vaidehi in it actually surrounds an altar space. And this is how the story kind of plays out in this space. And it actually is a backdrop for a Buddha statue, probably Shakyamuni and his two disciples on the altar space. And this is a very odd composition in portraying the story. This is a one-off. You never see this in the history of portraying the Ajatasattu narrative. You can see here, this is the palace coup happening, the lady visiting her husband, the king, the prince finding out his mother has been helping his father stay alive, the kind of tragic confrontation between son and the mother's weeping. And here the mother becomes imprisoned, and then she asks the Buddha for help, and the Buddha comes and teaches her how to meditate and liberate herself. So again, there's that kind of narrative from imprisonment to transcendence. These are the two side panels, which are also very interesting. They show kind of the lady listening to the preaching of the Buddha in an open landscape, which is very odd because this scene should happen in prison, but the painters have chosen to portray it in landscape. And amongst these kind of vignettes of the Buddha preaching to her, there's this very strange figure walking out from a doorway and looking at water. This is the only figure in the entire mural that is looking at landscape. So in previously, there's in the story, when the story is happening, you can see all the characters kind of minding their own business. They are in this beautiful landscape, but they don't really realize their context. They don't know they're in this mountainous realm. And this figure really changes. This figure kind of turns and looks at the flowing waters and the hilltops. And people have different theories about who this figure is. It kind of looks like a monk or a guard. I think it's Vaidehi herself. I think this is portraying this woman kind of experiencing this kind of human tragedy, and gradually, through the help of the Buddha, understanding that she is in prison and she's moving out and she has awareness of landscape. It's a very kind of a mental change from not knowing that you're in landscape to understanding you're in this kind of, you have an opportunity to enter into this transcendental realm. So as you can see here, the Buddha is always connected to landscape. Usually we think landscape is Chinese, it's secular, it has no religious connotations. Here it's deeply related to Buddhism, that the Buddha, when the Buddha appears, he brings landscape with him. So it's so powerful that he can bring her out of her prison and they can sit in this open air environment. And I do think this entire cave is trying to kind of replicate that change by putting the Buddha in this kind of landscape terrain. That it is trying to, for people that enter into this cave, you're supposed to kind of think about Vaidehi's journey from being imprisoned to seeking kind of Buddhist enlightenment. And when you enter the cave, you're looking at the Buddha in landscape. And this is kind of the ideal setup that the cave is trying to recreate, that it's using Vaidehi as a central figure to help you unlock this cave. So I'm still working on this topic, and I would love to have some of your comments or certain ideas that I can kind of probe further, of thinking about what does it mean for a woman to look at landscape in this moment. So today we've looked at why is Dunhuang really important? What are the Donghuan Caves? And kind of, I gave you kind of a little preview of what I've been working on as a kind of ongoing project. And I hope that one day we can return to the Mogal Caves in the future. So thank you very much. You can contact me at, this is my email address, and I would be happy to, for any kind of questions. Thank you very much.
Anne, thank you so much. Before we go, we have a couple of questions. If you have some time to address them now, and then the rest, I would invite everyone, Anne very kindly just invited you to email questions to her directly at her BU address. So please do take advantage of that. I apologize if we're unable to get to your question in the limited time remaining. So Anne, the first question is, how actively do you think China is preserving the caves? Also, is the Chinese government planning on getting the manuscripts back from England and France?
I think Dunhuang is a very important cultural relic site, so it has a lot of attention and resources devoted from the government to preserving the caves. In terms of getting back the manuscripts, I think that's a general question for a lot of artifacts in places like the UK, like the Elgin marbles. It's the same type of scope of debate, of repatriation debates. So it would be an interesting thing to see. But what has happened is that places like the British Museum, British Library has done a wonderful job of digitizing everything they have and cataloging them. So for scholars like me, it's very easy to access a lot of these materials, and they are publicly available.
So our second question, I'm going to combine two questions because they're related to the same cave. Are the apsaras and winged gods from India, Central Asia, or Chinese traditions? And the second part is, where do scholars think the master painters who executed the dynamic wall paintings in Cave 285 originated? Where were they from? So both questions revolving around Cave 285.
That's a great question. I think apsaras, they that figure type we do see is from India, but these kind of flying fairies, we have them in kind of Chinese mythology as well. There's kind of winged people in Chinese mythology, so I think there is kind of a conceptual blending between these. And in terms of painting technique, there are active workshops at Dunhuang. There are various workshops, and we have kind of painting pigments tools that we found at the site. Of course, these artisans do travel, so it really depends. I mean, there's multiple ways. It's possible that the painting sketches came to Dunhuang and they're working from sketches. It's possible that the artisans came. It's possible that the artisans locally retrained and came back. So there's less documentation of early caves, but from the 9th, 10th century, we have much more kind of real documentation of workshop practice.
Okay. Thank you so much. As a final question, you mentioned that each cave is different and we have to discuss them case by case. How did you approach Dunhuang art in your PhD dissertation? Did you focus on a single cave or several caves, and what theme unites them together?
Wow. I took a course on Dunhuang art, and I was given a very long bibliography, and my advisor just said every week we had to present on a cave. So we kind of went through it intensively for a whole semester, and I gradually gravitated to kind of Pure Land images from the Tang period. But it is so rich. It's like 1,000 years. It is very much some people like earlier caves, some people like later caves.
Oh, yeah, Dinhong is just, it's such a rich treasure trove of art, like Buddhist art in one location. I can only imagine what that seminar must have been like each week, doing a different cave and discussing it in depth. Well, I have to thank you, Anne, for discussing several caves in depth with us this evening. Thank you for this incredible illumination of the history and the art of Dunhuang. We so greatly appreciate it. This was an amazing opportunity to learn and to study with you, and thank you as always. And I want to thank also our audience this evening. Thank you for your patience, especially to the people whose questions I didn't get to. As I mentioned, please feel free to reach out to Anne at her BU address on your screen. And to everyone, thank you for spending your evening with us. As a reminder, I'd like to remind you to join us in 2 weeks' time. So that would be Thursday, August 27th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central. We will have a lecture given by Professor Christopher Nugent of Williams College, and his lecture he'll speak on Chang'an, the imperial capital of the Tang. We welcome you to join us at that time. Until then, thank you again, and I wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne.